My name is Robert Metzger. I'm director of the Reading Public Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I'm here with Fred Licht, who is the professor of art at Boston University and the curator of art at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice. And we're talking about revisionism, particularly focusing in on sculpture in the 20th century. But Fred is going to give us a historical perspective and talk a little about other reputations in other centuries and how they've risen and fallen, the waning of reputations, and the revitalization, which is really the most exciting thing about art and the study of art history. And I don't know where to begin or what century to begin in, but I'm sure you will. So do you want to just pull something out of past history or start with the
Why not
last
start with the Lasalle, which has so many connections in so many different directions that it's quite inexhaustible. So we can, do you want to introduce it as a 20th century?
Well, I feel it's prime 20th century art, and it's mid-century. Ibrahim Lasalle, of course, is still living in 1995, but he had a great beginning of his reputation with the abstract expressionists in the 50s and 60s, actually going back to the 40s historically, but with the rise of the New York School of action painting and abstract expression itself, which also encompassed sculpture. And I feel primarily when I look at this that it does have a very painterly look beyond just sculpture per se. The lattice work in it, it just is, it can be separated further out in its larger pieces. I feel the figural presence is always there, but I also feel an affinity with Jackson Pollock and the overall density of the lines and the composition.
I feel that too very strongly. I feel also a tremendous updraft that he has introduced into this sculpture, which after all is made of dense and heavy material, that he has managed to spiritualize it so that it doesn't respond to the normal pull of gravity, which we all feel, even though we're so used to it we don't think of it anymore, and has made it take on vitality of its own that creates its own field of dynamism and doesn't necessarily respond to the downward pull of gravity as the Rosati, for instance, does, where there's a definite response to gravity, a muscular pulling yourself together in order to liberate yourself. This is self-liberating. This has something so airy. And since you have put me into the role of what the futurists would have called a passatista, yes, someone who thinks only of the past, it does remind me in some ways of one of the most fascinating chapters in Leonardo da Vinci, who was fascinated, obsessed by the idea of knots and how they symbolize the coming together of different dynamics, how they pose a kind of enigma that we are immediately challenged to solve, to undo what has been done beyond our forces. And there's something of that I find in Lasalle.
Although Lasalle is abstract, I feel he never completely liberated himself from the figural tradition, which is, of course, the strongest tradition in sculpture, going back to the Greeks and Cycladic art before that. But it is so ingrained when we talk about sculpture that I feel it's still here, present, although I'm sure, or I can't be positive to get into the artist's mind, but I have the feeling that Lasalle was trying to liberate himself from the figure when he made this.
Very definitely, and has left it behind as an organism to be transmitted. But I feel he's created a figural art of his own. Another quality that I particularly admire about Lasalle and about this piece in particular is a quality that is somehow more apparent in 20th century sculpture than in earlier periods, the feeling of wit, of humor, of a lack of solemnity, which earlier sculpture almost always has. And here there is, well, the French spirituel, which can be just spiritual but also witty, the two taken together.
Yes, and that comes from the freedom of the material here, because it's, of course, a new material, even in the 50s, using this kind of metal, and the twisting of it, and still getting the wonderful texture and color, because at the extreme edges of it, the appendages, you get this darker coloration, whereas you look at it from a distance, you get that overall golden glow, which just radiates from it. I mean, the color is so important here, and the contrast of the darker areas, and especially where they're placed, this is akin to some kind of human appendage.
You said that sculpture always refers to the body, and of course it always does, but it is something that demands something from us, a muscular, physical, but also always a spiritual interrelationship that makes it somehow, well, it's always been the art of sacrality.
Yes.
The idol, the
totem.
The totem.
Fetish figure. When we talk about art in the 20th century, of course, we are living in a predominantly abstract century, or at least I see it that way. The great contribution to the visual arts was the breakthrough of Kandinsky, and I like to think in our own country of Arthur Dove as being among the first. It's always hard to pinpoint the very first in anything, in any field of endeavor, including art. But when we think of the antecedents of Kandinsky and Arthur Dove and the abstractionists, which culminated in the wonderful pinnacle of American art with abstract expressionism at mid-20th century, and it's hard for me to believe that we're almost a half century away and into the next century, but on a two-dimensional surface, it seems easier to get the illusion of abstraction than it is with the three-dimension. And abstract expressionism as a movement has often been talked about primarily as a painting movement, the flat two-dimensional surface lending itself so much more to abstraction.
Two-dimensional is almost automatically abstraction because we experience reality in 3 dimensions. So anything that takes a third of our reality away is going to be abstract immediately. And sculpture doesn't do that, and that's one of the many reasons why sculpture is so unpopular in our days. And sculpture, which always tends towards the monumental, towards a public statement that includes the community, a painting can be very intimate. A sculpture always requires something communal. It has to express something to a larger body, a larger number of people. And that's why we are no longer dealing with three-dimensional images in our daily life. When you think of even the 19th century, in which monuments, church sculpture, architectural sculpture was an everyday necessity almost, and you saw it everywhere. You dealt with it consciously or not. Whereas now we see billboards, we see television screens, we see movie screens, all two-dimensional images. That we're familiar with, illustrations in books. But the three-dimensional object is something that has become alien to us. We do not raise monuments, we're afraid of monuments.
Partly a part of the automobile culture. I happen to be from Detroit, Michigan. I have a body by Fisher, and I'm made in Detroit, and I'm proud of it. But just as you said, I picked up on the mobility of the fact that sculpture requires active participation. If you're really going to experience a sculpture, there's never just one point of view, unless it's a bas-relief, which is very much closer to a painting. But to really experience sculpture, you really have to look at it from all 3 sides and to actively go around it. With sculpture, I find it so fascinating that you think you know a piece and then you see it in a whole new light by just a different angle or different lighting. Lighting is so important. I mean, a painting has to be lit fully from surface to surface, but if you get a different angle on a sculpture, it can give you a whole new aesthetic experience.
It takes much more time to acquaint yourself with a sculpture than with a painting. Part of that, again, is that we're more used to scanning and scanning successfully.
Yes.
You can't scan a sculpture. And that insistence on robbing us of time is something that many of us resist.
Of course, I think all of 20th century art, sculpture and painting, has been pointing in the direction of freedom. Freedom of expression, freedom to express ideas, but also freedom of technique. And of course, the great example, historical example, is Hans Arp, or Jean Arp, if you come from the German or French tradition, of his great work, Objects Arranged According to the Laws of Chance, in which we're told in our art history text that he threw a group of pieces of paper in the air and they landed wherever, and this is a great composition. Now, again, he is a great plastic three-dimensional artist, but when he did this great breakthrough with freedom, which influenced everyone, including Pollock, it was on a flat surface, these pieces of paper. And I've shown that to many students, and they've always been very skeptical. Are you sure he didn't just push this one here or there? And freedom, I guess it's the dichotomy between freedom and discipline that we're talking about.
Every artist has the right to lie about his work. I think that's fundamental. But your choice of art is important in many ways. But one way that I want to lift out is that it's true, it's a flat surface, but it is not a two-dimensional surface, because another two-dimensional surface has been added, which makes it three-dimensional. Right. So that after Cubism, and especially after collage, it's painting that becomes sculptural, really. Even a Mondrian, pure surface, but it is presented in front of the frame, not surrounded by the frame, in his framing, in Mondrian's framing, so that it presents itself as an object, as a piece of canvas with certain rhythms and colors imposed on it, and therefore binds itself to sculpture in a very typically 20th century way, whereas earlier painting goes in back of the frame and retires from you, drawing you into it. The presence, the actual, sometimes aggressive presence of sculpture is reflected in 20th century painting to a great extent.
And I think some of the pioneers of sculpture were responsible for this. I saw within the course of a few days the Mondrian show in New York and the Brancusi show in Philadelphia. And who knows who was looking at what? We'd have to go back and check dates and see what was available. But the synergy between Brancusi and Mondrian is marvelous. And Brancusi, of course, being arguably the most pivotal sculptor of the 20th century. We could debate about that.
Not with me, because I think he is. But the materials, I think, is something else that makes sculpture so much more difficult for much of the public today. We're used to oil paint, acrylic. These are things that we've handled. The sculptural materials are so important. If you glance from this metal sculpture to the Rosati in plaster, which is a friable substance, something that has none of the attraction to caresses that metal, especially polished metal, has. And when you remember that Giacometti said that plaster is the most spiritual of materials, it has no aggressive substance or character of its own, then you see how Lassalle needs the metal. You see a plaster model of this, and it's simply
flat,
not there. Whereas you translate that into metal, and you've lost a great deal. And to become sensitive to these changes. My last exhibition was a Giacometti exhibition based on the confrontation of his gessos with his bronzes, and how he didn't really want the bronze. It was forced on him by market conditions, by dealers, by collectors. He had to live. But it was the plaster, that phantomatic quality of plaster, that went so beautifully hand in hand with what he had to say. And that's true of the Rosati, too.
Now, speaking of materials, where would you put terracotta or clay? Would you make that akin to the plaster? How would Giacometti have felt about clay, the most common of sculptural materials from ancient times?
But he didn't use it. There is something else, again, that is involved in terracotta. It has to be fired. It requires a far greater degree of craftsmanship than plaster. Plaster is much more reticent and has to be built in a way that is very different.
You need an armature.
You need an armature.
Yes.
You need to know how to cast the plaster onto the armature. That's why it's so important that people who are interested in art see the process of the various materials.
Yes.
Just as you have to know, if you're going to deal with drawings, the difference between a quill pen, a steel pen, a reed pen, a brush drawing. And once you've seen it, the painting, the drawing, it looks entirely different to you, because you know what the artist had to go through to get at that effect.
And of course,
a variety of sculpture is, again, at once very exciting, but also makes it more difficult to approach. For instance, if we put next to the Lassalle a sculpture such as this, by a contemporary of Lassalle, Stankiewicz, you have something that is a total negation of all the sculptural principles of the Lassalle. Transparent, dynamic, constant, radiating into space, bringing, enfolding space, also embracing space, making space part of the volume of the sculpture. Maybe to focus a little better at a different kind of sculpture, we ought to take this. I'm always very upset when I don't have white cotton gloves to handle these things with. But here, everything is played on the stability, on the hypnotic quality that brings you to it and arrests you. The sharply outlined quality of each volume, the contour, which was deliberately mobile and fugitive in the other sculpture, here gives you a massive quality that arrests you, that makes you stare. And of course, the technique is a totally different one, of found objects brought together by the will and the intuition of the artist. It's a particularly fascinating piece that has a frontal view that gives it a certain theatricality. You approach it along a set axis.
Yes, a hierarchical interest here, almost like an Egyptian seated figure. I mean, it has so many antecedents art historically, but we know this is uniquely 20th century material because the objets trouvé were just discarded products of industrial civilization. Richard Stankiewicz loved to go out to junkyards, and he's from Detroit, Michigan, the automobile capital, and I think there was a great interest from the motor car. He did a much different thing than Chamberlain did with automobiles, but they were all kinds of mechanical parts, and they were always machine-made and machine-derived. And of course, this piece is called Grandmother and Child, where we have actually very little change in the child. It's a part of a motor or a machine that is just there. Of course, he, like Ibram Lassalle, welded these pieces of industrialization together, but gave the grandmother a chair to sit on. It's a four-legged creature here with a concave face and a very relaxed pose, just because of this wonderful curve of the torso, and it's totally convincing as an abstraction on the human form, and very graceful in its own way. And there's a poignancy here. There's a closeness of the mother and child. You see that the child is hovering close to the grandmother's chair, and it really can affect a viewer on an emotional level as well as an intellectual level of this inventiveness of the artist in placing these disparate pieces of metal together, which meant nothing before assembled by being assembled by Stankiewicz.
And yet they bring their past history to the new state of existence. And I love the way he has interpenetrated grandmother and chair. You can't tell one from the other. They have become one. And the quality of the periscope here, something is looking out at you that you can't see. You are being tested, you are being spied on with that steadfastness that perhaps alludes to the wisdom and the perceptiveness of old people. I think you're quite right to take the grandmother title very seriously.
But also, it seems like a maquette for a monument. You almost could see this in a public space where a person could come and walk around this on a human scale. And it's very diminutive here, but that's a great thing about sculpture, again, that you can see a maquette here with two live human beings, so you can get the scale of it to our dimensions. And yet, if we had this in a photograph and with a neutral background, again, the reality and the perception of reality, you could very much get the illusion that it was a very large, grandiose monument in some public space.
Absolutely, yes. That is, of course, another great necessity of sculpture, that you measure up against it. We can only learn sculpture by standing in front of it.
It's now getting to the end of the century. It's very curious to know what artists, what monuments will last into the next century, and how they will be reevaluated. I feel very strongly about our American abstract expressionist movement in both painting and sculpture, and although sculpture has been sometimes diminished in that movement, it's arguably the very pinnacle of American visual creativity, beginning in the late 40s, reaching its climax, I guess, somewhere in the 50s. But how do you feel it's going to last into the next century, the reputations and just the meaningfulness of these objects for people of the next generation or two?
I'm not a prophet. I've always been wrong in predictions of that sort. But that is something so normal, so organic to the flood and ebb of human sensibility.
The human spirit, yeah.
that it's bound to happen. There are also national characteristics that are involved in it. Why do we in America simply not think about an artist such as Ipustegui, who is very talented.
One of the great artists of the 20th century.
Artists of the 20th century in Germany, in France, in Scandinavia, in Holland. He is accepted as one of the most important figures of our time. We in America simply can't deal with him and refuse to deal with him. There must be a reason for that.
One reason has to be the movable parts and the removable parts. I've always felt about Ipustegui that unsettled Americans. I lived with an Ipustegui in one of my jobs, and there were these parts that could be taken off and put back on, and I think there's a sense of impermanence there that unsettles Americans.
Impermanent Americans.
Impermanent Americans.
Who are so mobile.
Yes, it's an irony.
So open-ended, demand a certain counterpart in art that makes us feel settled. Another artist who has troubled me as far as reputation is concerned is Seymour Lipton, who is an artist I've always considered at the very top of the list of American artists, and who has never really had the response from the public, from the museums, from the critics, that he should have had. And I can't figure it out. Here is a talent of tremendous variety, vitality, inventiveness. He just has all the trump cards in his hands, and he plays them beautifully, and nobody is willing to pick up the trick. Will he, in the next 20 years, be seen for what I think he was? I hope so. I think he deserves it.
He was terribly articulate about his work, and I never realized how important drawing was to a sculpture, and he was a prolific draftsman, and these looked like Matisse sketches. They were so economy of means in terms of just a few lines, but was able to grasp incredibly three-dimension volumetric concepts in just the flat sheet of paper. This is one of his marvelous charcoal drawings in which he, with just a few slashes, is able to get a marvelous feeling for volume and three-dimensional space, and with the great shading here, the dark areas of the immense hollows that transform his work. This is not a maquette for the piece behind Fred, but this is the piece that we have here. In reality, is horizontal. This is a vertical piece. But I think the drawing is so important for most sculptures. Very few begin with just a concept or a piece of clay and mold it. I think many in public feel that an artist just begins with a piece of, or a sculptor begins with a piece of wood or clay or metal and somehow forms it or crafts it. And I don't think this is his modus operandi here.
It's wonderful. One of the most admirable things about Lipton's every piece is the way he makes the base participate in the, you can't even call it a base. It grows out of its own roots in a way that very, very few sculptors have managed to do. Getting back to the problem you posed of prophecy, there is no standard to which I can appeal, so that this business of we all play the game of wanting to know, will this sculptor like Seymour Lipton ultimately gain the fame that he should enjoy?
Artists who were not valued monetarily at all in their lifetimes and have risen dramatically, and that is certain to happen in the 20th century.
We have come to a dissociation with the artist as a creative force that makes it very, very difficult to deal with the situation. And there again, I think the education that museums owe their public, that universities owe their public, that newspapers owe their public, that still has to be forthcoming.